The gilded cage of Arthur and Alara's life was built not of gold, but of polished brass and relentless aspiration. From the outside, their three-bedroom semi-detached house, with its meticulously tended rose bushes, appeared a picture of suburban contentment. Inside, it thrummed with a quiet, desperate energy, generated almost entirely by Alara. Arthur was a cartographer by trade, a man who found solace in the precise lines of maps, the certainty of contours, and the silent stories of landscapes. His world was one of measured distances and calculated scales. Alara's world, in stark contrast, was a blur of glossy magazines, influencer-curated Instagram feeds, and the tantalizing, ever-receding horizon of a life she felt she deserved, but could never quite grasp. She was a woman who saw life as a catalog of things she didn't own, and her husband as the disappointing gatekeeper to that catalog. "Another map, Arthur?" She'd sigh, her voice a delicate instrument of disappointment, as he spread his parchment across the dining table, pushing aside a centerpiece she'd spent too much on. "Don't you ever get tired of drawing lines that lead nowhere?" He would look up, his kind, bespectacled eyes blinking behind his glasses. "Every line leads somewhere, my dear. You just have to know how to read it." He'd meant it as a gentle philosophical point, but to Alara, it was just another example of his prosaic nature. The trouble, the deep, foundational crack in their marriage, was money. Or rather, Arthur's perceived lack of ambition in its acquisition. He worked for the Ordnance Survey, a respectable but modestly paid government job. His passion was in the artistry of cartography, not the climb up a corporate ladder. For Alara, who had married him during a brief period of infatuation with his quiet intelligence, this had become an unforgivable sin. She saw his contentment as laziness, his passion as a hobby that paid the bills but not for the lifestyle she craved. Their arguments were never loud, explosive things. They were cold fronts, settling over the house for days. They were sighs over unpaid credit card bills, pointed comments about her friend Clara's new Mercedes, and the way her eyes would glaze over when he tried to explain the beauty of a perfectly rendered river delta. "We could have a river delta view from a penthouse, Arthur," she'd once said, and the silence that followed was more crushing than any shout. The catalyst for the earthquake that would shatter their world was a man named Julian Thorne. Julian was a property developer, all sharp suits, sharper smiles, and a tan that spoke of winter sun in Dubai. Alara met him at a charity gala she had insisted they attend, an event that strained their finances for months. While Arthur stood awkwardly by the punch bowl, Julian had swooped in, a predator recognizing easy prey. He was everything Arthur wasn't: loud, confident, and dripping with the kind of casual wealth that made Alara's heart beat a frantic, illicit rhythm. The affair began with flirty texts, graduated to long lunches, and soon settled into a pattern of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at a discreet boutique hotel in the city center. For Alara, it was like stepping from her monochrome world into full, vibrant color. Julian spoke of yachts and investments, of a life unburdened by budgetary constraints. He fed the hungry, gaping void of her avarice, and she gorged herself. Arthur, in his map-filled study, noticed the change. The new perfume, the longer hours at her part-time gallery job, the secretive smile that played on her lips when her phone buzzed. He was a man who read the subtle topography of human emotion for a living. He couldn't miss the shifting landscape of his own wife. A cold dread settled in his stomach, a premonition of a coming cataclysm. He began to withdraw further, burying himself in a special, secret project, a hand-drawn, immensely detailed map of a fictional island. He called it Alara's Haven, a place he was building for her in ink and imagination, a perfect world where he hoped she might one day want to stay. The day of reckoning was a Tuesday. A torrential downpour lashed against the windows. Arthur, citing a need for specific archival paper, had come home early. He found them in his own bed, a tangle of limbs and expensive linen. The scene was not one of passionate love, but of a brutal, transactional collision. The shock was a physical blow. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't say a word. He simply stood in the doorway, his waterproof coat dripping onto the hardwood floor, his face a map of utter devastation. Then he turned and walked away. Alara, flushed with a mixture of panic and a strange, defiant thrill, followed him. "Arthur, wait. It's not what you think." He stopped in the hallway, his back to her. "I think it's exactly what it appears to be, Alara. A boundary has been crossed. There's no uncharted territory here. The divorce was swift and brutal, orchestrated by Alara with a cold efficiency that stunned even her lawyer. She wanted out. She wanted her freedom. She was convinced Julian was her golden ticket. Arthur, broken and unable to fight, agreed to everything. He didn't contest. He signed the papers in his solicitor's office with a hand that trembled only slightly, his eyes hollow. He gave her the house, its contents, and a sizable portion of his savings. She didn't know he had a final, misguided act of care. "I hope he makes you happy," Arthur said, his voice a ghost of its former self. As they parted ways for the last time outside the courthouse, the rain was falling again, a pathetic fallacy that felt cruelly appropriate. "He will," Alara said, her chin held high, not meeting his eyes. "He can give me the life I deserve." She moved in with Julian, into his sleek, minimalist apartment that felt more like a showroom than a home. For a few heady months, it was everything she had dreamed of. There were expensive dinners, weekends in Paris, a new wardrobe, but slowly, the gloss began to wear off. Julian was often away on business. His phone was permanently locked, and his generosity came with strings of control and expectation. The man who had seemed like a savior began to look more like a jailer in a gilded cell. The arguments started, and they were nothing like the cold silences with Arthur. They were volcanic, destructive, filled with cruel words and the chilling realization that Julian saw her not as a partner, but as a possession. Meanwhile, Arthur was unraveling. The divorce was the earthquake, but the aftershocks were a perpetual, grinding tremor that slowly consumed him. He rented a small, sparse flat, its walls bare save for the wall where he pinned the growing, intricate map of Alara's Haven. He stopped going to work, taking early retirement on meager savings. His friends, few as they were, tried to reach out, but he was an island, and he had deliberately burned all the boats. He haunted the local library during the day, reading old travelogues and mythology, and at night, he would sit in his armchair, staring at the map. He was mapping his grief, every cove and mountain range a memory, every forest a representation of the years they had shared. He stopped eating properly. His clothes hung loose on his frame. The light in his kind eyes, the one that had seen the beauty in a contour line, was extinguished. The trauma of her betrayal was a poison in his veins, and he had no antidote. He was dying of a broken heart, a slow, deliberate suicide by sorrow. A year after the divorce, Julian left Alara. He cleaned out their joint account and left a note on the kitchen island next to a half-empty bottle of champagne. It read simply, "This was fun, but it's run its course. Don't try to find me." The gilded cage was exposed as painted rust. She was alone, nearly penniless, and the stark reality of what she had done began to press in on her. The house she had taken from Arthur was sold to pay off her debts, the proceeds vanishing like mist. She found a small, dreary studio apartment and took a job as a receptionist, the glamour of her previous life. A bitter, mocking memory. It was in this state of humiliated poverty that she, by chance, heard about Arthur. She ran into an old mutual acquaintance at the supermarket, who told her, with a tone of sad reproach, that Arthur had become a recluse. "He's not well, Alara. People say he's just fading away." A sliver of something pity, or perhaps the first, faint stirring of guilt pricked at her. She pushed it down. He was weak, she told herself. He couldn't handle the real world. 2 years to the day after their divorce was finalized, Arthur died. It was his neighbor who found him, peaceful in his armchair, his hand resting on a stack of finished maps. The official cause was heart failure, but anyone who had known him knew the truth. He had simply given up. Alara heard the news through the same grapevine. She felt a jolt, but it was a distant, muffled thing. She didn't go to the funeral. What was the point? It was a closed chapter, a sad, pathetic ending to a man she had left behind. Weeks turned into months. The sharp edges of her own failed life began to blur into a monotonous gray. Then, a thick, official-looking envelope arrived. It was from a solicitor, a Mr. Aldridge. The letter stated that as Arthur's sole next of kin, they had never had children, and he was an only child, orphaned young. She was the beneficiary of his will. He had named no one else. A final, bewildering act from the man she had discarded. With a cynical curl of her lip, she assumed it was a pittance. Perhaps the remainder of his meager savings. A final, passive-aggressive gesture. She almost threw the letter away, but a flicker of morbid curiosity made her schedule the appointment. Mr. Aldridge was an elderly man with a kind, tired face, and an office that smelled of old paper and polish, much like Arthur's study used to. He greeted her without judgment. "Mrs. Pembroke," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "It's Miss Thorne," she corrected, the name feeling like a lie on her tongue. "Of course. My condolences for your loss." Ilara gave a tight, dismissive nod. "Let's just get this over with, shall we?" "What little did he leave me?" Mr. Aldridge regarded her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to see right through her brittle facade. "Little?" he repeated softly. He opened a file on his desk. Arthur was a man of surprising habits and profound dedication. He slid a bank book across the desk. "This is a savings account, opened 23 years ago, just after you were married." Ilara picked it up. The first entry was a deposit of £50, then another, a few months later. 100. The amounts were small, consistent. She flicked through the pages, a chronicle of their life together. A deposit the month they bought the house, £1,000. A deposit when he got his promotion, 500. The entries continued, relentless, through every argument, every cold shoulder, every sigh of disappointment she had ever heaved in his direction. Her heart began to beat a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. She reached the final page. The running total made her breath catch in her throat. It was a staggering amount, over £350,000. This can't be right," she stammered. "His salary, he couldn't have. He lived on a fraction of what he earned," Mr. Aldridge said quietly. "He wore the same coats for a decade. He packed a lunch every day. He never took a holiday abroad. He told me once, shortly after you left, that every penny he didn't spend was a seed he was planting for your future. He called it the Ilara Fund." He never stopped. The room seemed to tilt. The Ilara Fund. The words echoed in the silent, tomb-like office. "But the divorce," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He gave me money then." "That was separate. This," Mr. Aldridge tapped the bank book, "was his life's work, his secret project. He continued to make deposits into it even after the divorce was finalized. The world stopped. The air was sucked from the room. He continued to make deposits, even after the divorce. The image of Arthur, alone in his sparse flat, deliberately depriving himself, saving for a woman who had shattered him, was an agony so acute it was physical. While she was squandering Julian's money on designer handbags, Arthur was putting his lunch money into a fund for her. While she was lying in a hotel bed, he was mapping a haven for her. While he was dying of grief, his love for her was the one constant, the true north on his personal compass. Mr. Aldridge then handed her a large, flat portfolio. "He also left you this." With shaking hands, she untied the ribbon and opened it. It was the map. Ilara's haven. It was breathtakingly beautiful. Every inch was covered in exquisite detail. There were no treacherous cliffs or barren deserts. Instead, there were forests of our first walk, the bay of shared laughter, the river of quiet understanding. In the very center of the island was a small, perfect cottage labeled, "The House We Could Have Had." And in the corner, in his fine, precise script, he had written a dedication. "For my Ilara, a map of the life I dreamed we would have. Every line, every contour, was drawn with you. In my heart. I always loved you. I always will, Arthur." The dam inside her broke. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat. It was a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that Mr. Aldridge flinched. The guilt did not simply wash over her. It erupted from within, a volcano of self-loathing that had been building for years. She saw it all now, with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. His quiet strength was not weakness. His contentment was not a lack of ambition. It was a deep, abiding love for the life they had, a life she had been too blind and greedy to see. He hadn't been mapping lines that led nowhere. He had been mapping a path to a happiness that was already theirs for the taking. If only she had known how to read it. She had traded a diamond for a shard of glass. She had thrown away a love as deep and constant as the ocean for a puddle that reflected a glittering false sky. And he had known. He had known what she was, and he had loved her anyway. He had loved her to the very end, funding her betrayal with his own suffering. She left the solicitor's office clutching the bank book and the map, the weight of the money an obscene mockery. The money was nothing. It was the ash of a burned-out star. The real inheritance was the map, and the devastating truth it contained. Back in her sterile studio, she pinned Alara's Haven to the wall. It was no longer a beautiful fantasy. It was an indictment. Every lovingly drawn tree was an accusation. Every whimsical place name was a memory of a moment she had dismissed or devalued. The house we could have had was a physical pain in her chest. She had the money now. She could buy the penthouse, the Mercedes, the designer clothes, but the very thought made her sick. The money was tainted, a monument to her avarice and his tragic devotion. It was blood money, paid for with a good man's life. She tried to spend it once. She went to a luxury car dealership, the same one where Julian had bought his sports car. A slick salesman approached her. "Looking for something special, madam?" She looked at the gleaming vehicles, symbols of everything she had thought she wanted. And all she could see was Arthur's worn coat, his packed lunch, his hollow eyes. She fled, vomiting into a pristine ornamental shrub outside. The guilt became her constant companion, her prison. It was a colder, more desolate cage than any she had ever known. She was rich, but she lived like a pauper, because to spend the money was to desecrate his memory further. She was free, but she was a ghost, haunting the ruins of the life she had destroyed. She would lie awake at night, tracing the lines of the map with her eyes in the darkness, visiting the Bay of Shared Laughter, remembering a day at the beach when he'd clumsily built a sandcastle and made her laugh until she cried. She would wander through the forests of our first walk, the memory of his shy, proud smile as he showed her his favorite hiking trail, a knife twist in her soul. She understood her fault now, with a depth that was absolute and annihilating. She had been a fool, blinded by the cheap glitter of materialism, unable to recognize the profound, quiet treasure she had possessed. She had mistaken his deep, still waters for shallowness, but the understanding had come too late. The one person whose forgiveness she now desperately needed, the one person whose love had been unconditional and true, was gone. He had died believing she was a greedy, faithless woman, and he had loved her anyway. There was no punishment greater than that knowledge. The money sat in the bank, a cursed fortune. The map hung on her wall, a beautiful, heartbreaking lie. Ilara had gotten everything she thought she wanted. She had her divorce, her freedom, and now, more money than she knew what to do with. And in the crushing, silent weight of it all, she finally understood the cost of her greed. She had not just lost a husband, she had destroyed a masterpiece of a man, and in the process, she had mapped herself onto a desolate island of regret, from which there was no escape and no return. The treasure had been real, but she had sold the map for a handful of fool's gold. And now, she was left with all the riches in the world, and a soul that was utterly, irrevocably bankrupt.